Iran spent nearly 50 years quietly building the most sophisticated financial escape hatch in modern geopolitical history, and then, in a single catastrophic decision, it blew it up with its own hands. Welcome to Global Conflict Feed. I'm David. What you're about to hear is not a story about missiles or nuclear centrifuges. It is a story about money, specifically about how one gleaming, commerce-driven city kept a heavily sanctioned nation breathing for 5 decades, and how that nation repaid the favor by launching hundreds of ballistic missiles directly at it. Before we get into the collapse, you have to understand the foundation, because without understanding how this arrangement worked, the scale of the self-destruction doesn't fully land. When the United States imposed its first round of sanctions against Iran in 1979, Tehran found itself progressively locked out of the global financial system. By the mid-2000s, targeted pressure on Iranian banks and oil revenues tightened the vice further. On paper, that kind of economic isolation should have brought the regime to its knees within months, but it didn't. And the reason why is sitting across the Gulf, just a short maritime crossing from Iran's coastline, Dubai. Here's what most people don't realize. By the year 2010, more than 8,000 Iranian-owned companies were registered and fully operational inside Dubai's free trade zones. Annual bilateral trade between the two reached somewhere between $16 and $28 billion at its peak. Iranian non-oil exports alone were running at roughly $6 to $7 billion annually, all flowing through these same networks. A former senior official at the United States Treasury once publicly described Dubai as, and this is a direct quote, the most important hub in Iran's entire sanctions evasion architecture. Think about what that means. America's own financial enforcement arm was openly acknowledging that its closest Gulf partner had become the central artery for the very country Washington was trying to economically strangle. Now let's talk about how the actual mechanism worked, because this was not a back-alley shadow operation. It was an industrial-scale, highly efficient machine running in broad daylight. Iranian oil tankers would anchor offshore in international waters. Under cover of night, crews transferred cargo onto vessels carrying cleaner, third-country documentation. Those ships would then sail directly into Jebel Ali, one of the world's busiest commercial ports, where handlers logged the shipments as routine imports. From there, proceeds cycled back through layers of Dubai-registered accounts. Meanwhile, electronics, vehicle components, and medical equipment Iran desperately needed were shipped into Dubai, relabeled for UAE-based businesses, and quietly re-exported across the border. The whole machine ran on 3 things: proximity, speed, and a city that had built its entire commercial identity around being the Gulf's premier middleman. But there was a human dimension to this relationship that went far deeper than cargo manifests and shell companies. Iranian families didn't just pass through Dubai, they settled. They purchased property, launched restaurants, ran shipping firms, enrolled their children in local schools, and wove themselves into the city's social fabric. By the early 2000s, estimates placed the Iranian diaspora in Dubai at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 people. They were embedded across gold trading, textiles, construction, and maritime commerce. Miad Maliki, a former senior United States Treasury sanctions strategist, put it plainly: the UAE was not merely one of several important financial hubs for the Iranian regime, it was the single most critical jurisdiction in the entire sanctions evasion architecture. Without Dubai, Iranian factories would have slowed within weeks, hospitals would have faced supply shortages within months, and the funding pipelines running to proxy forces across the region, in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, would have tightened considerably. But the regime had room to breathe, and in a system under that kind of sustained pressure, the distance between breathing and suffocating is everything. Then 2026 arrived and rewrote the entire equation. On February 28th, a joint American-Israeli military operation, designated Operation Epic Fury, launched coordinated airstrikes against Iranian military command infrastructure. Iran retaliated hard, firing ballistic missiles and combat drones across the region. But what stunned strategists and analysts was not the retaliation itself. It was the target. A massive portion of Iran's strike package was directed at the UAE, the very country that had quietly kept Tehran financially viable for nearly half a century. According to UAE Ministry of Defense reporting, by April 1st, Iran had fired 438 ballistic missiles, 2,012 drones, and 19 cruise missiles at targets inside the UAE alone. In just the opening wave, the UAE reportedly absorbed approximately 63% of Iran's initial barrage. Jebel Ali, the container port responsible for 36% of Dubai's entire GDP, was forced to suspend operations after a berth caught fire following debris from an intercepted missile. Dubai International Airport sustained multiple strikes over several weeks. A drone impact at the port of Fujairah halted oil loading operations. Abu Dhabi's flagship refinery, capable of producing 922,000 barrels per day, was shut down. And on April 2nd, the IRGC announced it had deliberately struck an Oracle data center in Dubai. Combined UAE stock markets lost over $120 billion in value. At least 12 civilians were killed, nearly 190 were injured. Jason Brodsky of United Against Nuclear Iran described the strategic reality bluntly. Dubai was an economic lung for the Iranian regime, and Iran had chosen to puncture it, because here is what Iran fatally miscalculated. It assumed that commerce would outlast politics, that Dubai's bankers, merchants, and free zone operators would quietly absorb whatever happened diplomatically or militarily, because the financial incentives were simply too powerful to abandon. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Iran didn't just cross a red line, it destroyed the one bridge it still desperately needed. And so Dubai struck back, not with weapons, but with something Iran feared far more: financial annihilation. Beginning in early March, billions of dollars in Iranian-linked assets inside UAE banks were frozen. These weren't dormant private savings accounts. These were regime-linked funds, shell companies masking illicit oil trades, hidden reserves quietly sustaining Tehran's operational networks for years. UAE security forces arrested dozens of currency exchange operators directly tied to IRGC financial networks. Not low-level actors, but trusted, long-established figures who had spent years converting shadow oil revenues into dollars, dirhams, and euros. Hard currency that flowed directly back to fund Iran's military and proxy operations. Companies connected to these networks were shuttered without warning. Visas were revoked, including coveted long-term golden visas. Some business figures found themselves stranded outside the country. Others scrambled to relocate operations to cities far from Dubai's now hostile commercial environment. The institutional closures sent the clearest signal of all. The Iranian hospital, serving the community since the 1970s, was ordered shut, including its emergency services. Iranian schools were closed. Community centers and cultural spaces sealed for decades were locked overnight. Think about what each of these moves means in practical terms. Frozen assets mean cash cannot flow. Shuttered exchange houses mean currency conversions stall. Revoked visas mean fewer operators can keep the system running. Close the schools and the hospitals, and you are telling the entire community, you are no longer welcome here. And when all of those pressures land simultaneously, something else takes hold: uncertainty. Even the parts of the system that technically remained open no longer felt stable. Every shipment attracted extra scrutiny, compliance costs rose, insurance costs rose, and that accumulated friction, sustained over weeks and months, becomes almost as damaging as a direct shutdown. The consequences inside Iran are now visible in real time. The rial is trading at approximately 1,470,000 to the dollar on the parallel market, the weakest level ever recorded in Iranian history. Year-on-year inflation climbed to 71.8% by March 2026, up sharply from 42% at the end of 2025. Bread prices climbed another 18%. Rice is up 12% in the first quarter alone. Medicines and spare parts that once flowed reliably through Dubai's channels are disappearing from shelves. Why did Iran do this? Why would a government strike the city that was keeping it economically alive? The answer lies in how Tehran had come to view the UAE in the years approaching 2026. The Emirates had steadily deepened its ties with Washington, militarily, economically, strategically. It had built a quiet but unmistakable relationship with Israel, particularly following the Abraham Accords of 2020. From Tehran's perspective, Dubai had stopped being neutral ground. It had started to look like an operational extension of a coalition working directly against Iranian interests. In Iran's strategic calculus, striking the UAE was also meant to shake Dubai's identity as a globally safe commercial hub, to trigger investor flight by making the city feel dangerous and unstable. The strikes were economic pressure delivered through military means, but Iran overestimated how much the UAE would absorb, and dramatically underestimated how much it still depended on Dubai's tolerance. In attempting to send a message to the entire region, Tehran torched its own oxygen supply. That is not strategy, that is desperation, and the damage extends far beyond the Gulf. Nearly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran moved to threaten commercial shipping through that passage, the effects became global within days. Tankers began rerouting around Africa, adding 2 to 3 weeks to delivery windows and burning millions in additional fuel costs. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf surged by 300%. Oil prices spiked above $110 per barrel. Global equity markets reacted sharply. The Dow Jones fell over 400 points, and the S&P 500 dropped approximately 7% over the same period. The International Energy Agency's director described the overall situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in recorded history. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, please hit the like button right now and subscribe to Global Conflict Feed. We cover the stories that are actually reshaping the balance of power, and this one is as consequential as it gets. Here is where this arc is heading. Iran is now navigating the most severe convergence of economic pressures in its modern history. Its currency is at a historic low. Inflation is above 70% year on year. Its primary sanctions evasion network is being dismantled in real time. And its relationship with the one city that made all of that survivable is now broken. Not strained, broken, because Iran chose to break it. Dubai was never simply a trading partner. It was the pressure valve. The workaround that made sustained sanctions feel survivable. The one system that gave Tehran room to breathe when every other door was closing. And Iran chose to bomb it. That decision will be studied for decades as one of the most consequential acts of strategic self-sabotage in modern geopolitical history. In attempting to demonstrate military reach and willingness to escalate, Iran accomplished something no Western government had managed in 45 years. It severed its own lifeline. The consequences are showing up not in press releases, but in disrupted supply chains, in hospitals without medicine, in factories without components, in families without schools, and in a diaspora community of hundreds of thousands watching their second home disappear around them. All of it traceable back to one decision made on February 28, 2026. This story is not over. The situation continues to evolve rapidly. But the arc is now clear. Iran turned off its own oxygen, and at Global Conflict Feed, we will be tracking every development as it unfolds. Hit subscribe, enable your notifications, and stay with us. The chapters still ahead of this story will be even more consequential than the ones we just walked through. I'm David. Thanks for watching.